What I'm going to cover within this presentation is research work LETI did. They've been heavily involved in obviously preparing various publications, the Climate Emergency Guide, the initial Retrofit Guide, and then the Workstream, which put this together. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. This is roughly the agenda. I'm aware there's a lot of people coming from different directions. I'll try and cover as much as I can on those, but we may, there's the opportunity to go back and look in more detail if you have particular queries. And I want to try and explain why a new way of thinking and how we brought it to the fore in our discussions, with the aim, we realized that we could potentially halve heat demand in a lot of our existing stock for about 2/3 less cost than whole building retrofit currently costs. And then I'll start to talk about where these opportunities have come about, and looking both at bottom up for new ideas as to what one does in design terms and procurement terms, but also looking at the top down opportunities because simply saying, oh, well, it could cost us more or whatever, because we're doing more retrofit, you do really need to be able to say, and where strategically is this money coming from? And that was included in this study. And then start a number of slides looking at process and policy highlights, at least run through those, because some of you may have questions with regard to those. So my background, originally studied architectural engineering, predominantly an engineer involved in building environmental side of things, zero carbon, going back 30 years, the first projects I was involved in, which were doing zero carbon. I'm involved in a fair number of things, for example, the net zero carbon building standard currently being developed, as well as Retrofit Academy and so forth and so on. So that's roughly my background. So design, then procurement and delivery aspects of retrofit at a variety of different scales. And this publication is available for you to download. It's fairly comprehensive. There's about just short of 200 pages in it. So it's a good read, or you can dip in and out. So home energy retrofit, I don't think it really needs me to tell you guys. It's a bit of a wicked problem. In other words, it has many facets to it. And LETI produced in 2021 their Climate Emergency Retrofit Guide. Now, this looked predominantly at best practice, and therefore NFIT and those kind of standards. And it was clear there was a role for a document like that. But what it did identify is in the feedback is there's a vast amount of the market which simply can't afford that. And that's where Retrofit-at-Scale, in other words, filling the gap, started to come from. And the strap line for this, the work stream that LETI put together was how many, how deep, and at what cost. Now, I have to say a big thank you to the large number of contributors, of which Nicola is there and many others. There's about 80 people involved in producing this document in different roles within the work stream, and technical reviewers, academic reviewers, policymaker reviewers, and so forth and so on. And you can see on this diagram, there's predominantly 7 work streams which were interfacing with each other continuously. Understanding what the CCC expected for our route to zero carbon, for example, was a real eye-opener and began to inform how far do we go on the fabric? How do you balance fabric and systems? How do you balance that with cost? How do you look at it scaling across the UK? And ultimately the costs there, and foremost in this as a driver, the social aspects to it. So a lot has been covered, and the challenge was pulling these all together and getting them, avoiding them each producing a PhD in their own subset. And what can we do as a collective which talks to a new way of doing things? The scale of the retrofit gap to be filled, nominally 28 million UK homes, and you find the best practice, the NFITs, the ACB, Energy Strong are scratching the surface. Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and its relabeling and so forth is scratching another little bit. But you find, well, there's so much more to do. And given existing housing is so much larger as a carbon emitting sector than new build, and it'll be, 5 times the size come 2050. You realize we've got an awful lot of work to do. And to put in perspective, 1% of homes have heat pumps, 2% are on communal or district heating. We're only touching the surface, hence the large gap. So the Retrofit-at-Scale identified this gap and realized we need something which looks at whole house retrofit, but tries to find something which is dramatically cheaper, more cost effective. And ultimately, it comes down to how we do retrofit, because that at the moment is still a little bit of a cottage industry. I'll come back to that in a little more detail. But the backdrop to all of this is, why aren't we getting pushed from the top level in government, from the Climate Change Committee, for example? And it's only by unpacking what their remit is, which is to get us to zero carbon in the most cost-effective way possible, you begin to realize why retrofit is slightly sidelined. Retrofit is about 3 times more expensive for saving carbon compared with buildings and wind turbines. That is the fact of the matter. Hence, national policy doesn't really look at retrofit. And indeed, enhancing new build is not on the agenda. It's that much more expensive. And besides, the wind turbine industry will attract their own investors and pay for it. So the government doesn't really need to do much for that decarbonising. But the left-hand image is from the CCC, and it's a graph showing the cost effectiveness in carbon abatement terms. And you can see wind, which is the yellow, has a negative value in this term, positive cost benefit, whereas residential heat and energy efficiency are at the other extreme. They're the more costly level. You've got to put a lot of money in per kilowatt hour or per ton of carbon saving. And the right-hand image is from the latest, the 7th carbon budget. And it shows the national trajectory at the moment. And it basically, it's only looking at 10% improvement on homes, roughly. And the vast majority of the route to zero carbon, they say, is simply switching to heat pumps. In other words, getting access to what those wind turbines are generated, for which they haven't had to pay. And to give a scale to all of this investment, or how much it's going to take to get us to zero carbon as a country, it's something like 1% of GDP. That's industry, transport, energy supply, buildings, all of them together. And you add that money together and divide it by between 28 million homes, that equates to about 36,000 per home. So there's no way we can start spending 60, 70, 80,000 a home for a deep retrofit of the sort of benefit across the board. There is a place for it, but not across the board. We are going to have to find something which is dramatically cheaper and demonstrate how it can be paid for. And the reason is, great, you get all this money to build the wind turbines from investors, but they're only offering a loan. They want their money back. Where does their money come from to get back? And the interest, the profit on that for them, it comes from us that pay the bills for that energy in future. We're cash cows. And therefore, we are likely to see high energy bills for the foreseeable future to pay off these investors. And that is the issue, because in social terms, as we all know, the costs to those who are in fuel poverty, those who are just coping and so on, is making life intolerable for them. And it ain't going to get any easier. The other is cheap energy. I remember them saying, what was it? Nuclear power was going to be so cheap, we won't need to even bill it. And well, that came, went and disappeared, for example. So the aim of the LETI Workstream to find out if there is a different way of getting to net zero carbon, which improves our homes and doesn't add to the overall cost of getting to net zero carbon. And zero carbon is evolving. Yes, I was involved in the BEDZ project in the 90s. We were looking at net zero carbon. You generated as much energy as you consumed as a development. That was because the grid was coal driven and you didn't want to engage with it. Moving on, and the late teens and the climate emergency declarations, the update to the zero carbon objectives for the UK, the discussion then at stage 2 were how much energy we could generate from renewables, and can we equate that to how much demand? How much do we need to reduce our demand, for example? That was stage 2. Stage 3 is moving into systems-wide thinking. We are but part of a system. Most of the decarbonising for us in buildings, even if we put a little bit of PV on our buildings, most of it, the lion's share of it, and certainly when we want to run our heating and it's cold. So now we are looking at it where someone else does most of the decarbonising of the energy. We have to look at how we as buildings enable that system to work. And that graph on the right simply shows that we shift everything from currently gas onto the electricity grid, we end up with a severe overload of the grid, even if we double its size. And I'll come back to that in more detail. So we are looking now at how we work in unison with the grid as a stage 3. But enough said on that. What the work stream was able to find was a way that if you go do enough savings in energy, we get savings in the national grid. We can then use that, reuse that money to help retrofit. For example, there's a number of other issues in there. For example, we've got to dramatically reduce the cost of doing the retrofits, for example. And I'm going to cover these issues one at a time as one goes through this presentation. So the new LETI approach to mass retrofit involves bottom up and top down. What gives you maximum bang for the buck? Well, we found heating does. We found there was an awful lot of inefficiencies in the process. We found doing a whole life assessment and a basic retrofit gave you the bang for the buck. We found a sweet point. How do you balance fabric first against changing the mechanical systems and switching over to air source heat pumps or the like. We found that controlling ventilation was absolutely paramount, not only given the moisture issues we're finding in upgraded homes, but generally air quality and so forth. And yes, as an energy saving as well. We found we could retrofit homes in a week, individual homes, but I'll touch on that in more detail. The top down, the shifting of investment towards more efficient use of energy, trying to redirect that money, trying to look at selling it as we are illustrating low-tech solutions, not high-tech hydrogen and massive storage of energy and so forth, which are still at the research stage, and we don't know how much they're going to cost and how effective they're going to be. We're also looking at potentially, if we need less energy for our homes, we still generate that energy, we still invest in that, but you then start exporting energy. We've a lot more renewable energy than a lot of other countries in Europe. The idea that just like coal in the past, oil and gas, we've become a net exporter of renewable energy is part of the top-down energy cost or retrofit cost equation. So where did these opportunities come out? On the left is the construction industry's very poor performance at increasing productivity over the years. The red line is where comparable industries have almost doubled, certainly 50% improvement in productivity over the last 30 years. We have not even moved. We are still working as a cottage industry. So you can see a lot of opportunities for improving process to try and make this a better package, not only for the occupants of the buildings, the owners of the buildings, but as an industry as a whole. The right-hand diagram comes from another industry, but it's not rocket science. If you want a certain quality level and you look at the costs of delivering it, you find there's this curve, bathtub curve, you might call it. If you spend all the money on a lot of softer things like quality control, vetting everything, certifying everything, so forth and so on, checking it, you can go to the nth degree. And there's a place for that. Passive House is brilliant at showing what is possible, and you get what's on the label and you pay for it. That's on the right-hand end of the curve. On the left-hand end of the curve is where we end up so often, where people try and save costs. So they take out all the softer stuff entirely and then force down the cost of the materials, the components. And you find it doesn't work. You end up with higher social and health costs and so forth and so on. What we want to find is somewhere in the middle. And that curve comes from the automotive industry, but it's applicable across a large number of industries which have tried to improve the product and the way we deliver it. I won't say any more about that. I will now flip to the other end of the spectrum. Why are we finding it so difficult to get householders, occupants engaged in this process? And these are the sorts of quotes we came across. I have no spare indoor space. And there we are wanting to put a heat pump with an enormous great cylinder into dwellings which simply don't have that kind of space. The level of disruption is simply not acceptable. The idea of 3 months to retrofit at your home, and we had so many which were 6 months because of the way construction industry works. It's so expensive. Where are the alternative price points? If you're buying a new car or even a second-hand car, you would expect to be able to have a choice of different price points and decide which level you wanted to go for, and you can still get from A to B with your car, for example. We don't offer that sort of thing. The idea of single point of contact, so forth and so on. The idea that a lot of householders, and I've just shown a sort of end of terrace or a semi or whatever in the diagram, I actually rather like to keep the look of my house as opposed to covering up all the historic features or what have you. So you're getting an awful lot of these pushbacks, which, to be perfectly honest, we in the industry have not really listened to. And I have to say it's going to get worse because retrofit's largely been done to larger homes to date. You look at heat pumps, they've largely gone into larger homes to date, not your average size home or your smaller size home. And therefore, we've got a mismatch in what the industry is offering at that level as well. We've learnt, for example, EPCs, those labels we have on, in theory, most of our homes, tell us a rating, and the bigger the number there, the poorer the energy rating. We've now got smart meter data to compare, and we find the actual energy use does not really relate to EPCs. And I think there's a lot of people now understanding that EPCs are not a very good metric for a variety of reasons. But what it does make clear is an EPC is not a good guide for what the most appropriate measures for retrofitting your homes, and certainly not for doing it cost effectively. You need to actually understand how energy is used in that particular home. And indeed, are the occupants in such fuel poverty, they simply aren't heating half their homes, for example. And that you will see through the meter data. On the right, we also then started looking more specifically at what tends to already be installed. And we find that most radiators, for example, indicative of a heating system, were shoved in so oversized that we have an opportunity there to replace it with a heat pump, which has a lower temperature output, therefore generally needs a larger radiator area. We've already got the areas in most of our dwellings. So why are we ripping out all these heating systems as opposed to simply switching over the heat pump? We also realized we're oversizing heat pumps pretty dramatically compared with people abroad who've got more experience. We did a whole set of different ways of modeling it. MCS is the way you have to do it if you want a grant. And they're looking at sizing, which is typically twice the size of some of the other modeling. We also found the way you control it tends to make sure it's oversized. In other words, you try and get all the heat out at one time, as opposed to smoothing it across the day so that you can then have a heat pump half the size working for twice as long, for example. There's a whole set of technical things in there. The only one I mentioned, the first one, air tightness. We guess at air tightness and we get it severely wrong. And there's a reason for that, and that's because they use the air tightness that you would have expected when that property was built, when most of us got fed up with the drafts and started plugging half the leaks. So most of them don't have air leakage at anything like the levels that the codes and recommendations suggest. We also started unpicking ventilation because of the moisture level issues, the condensation, the mold issues, which is becoming more and more important given certain court cases and so forth and so on. It is incredibly difficult to justify a proper ventilation system as things currently stand in our industry, because we are just being given the Rolls Royce with summer bypass and automatic controls. It does different things at different times and all the rest of it. I had the dubious pleasure of working for 3 years in Shanghai. They have certain air quality issue. They installed heat recovery ventilation units in every apartment due to air quality. A fan, 2 fans, heat exchanger, and some filters. exactly what we want for ventilation. No summer bypass, no fancy controls, fit and forget, simple and smaller. They're about a third smaller than the ones we can buy here. That's not to say we couldn't make them like that, but the industry is very happy to sell you the top end of the range. It's rather like electric cars. We'll sell you the top end until there's a market shake-up and you get the smaller models coming through with the lower cost points. You only get limited penetration into the market. But what we found is, for example, the graph top right simply says an MVHR, mechanical ventilation heat recovery unit, putting air specifically into the dwelling, taking it out again where it's polluted and recovering the heat, picks up considerably more moisture inside the dwelling than extract only and trickle vents, holes through the wall with cold air coming in, for example. We also found, bottom right, that the summer bypass, lots of people claim is essential, has almost irrelevance, is almost an irrelevance in the UK climate. It's great for Germany where temperatures go up higher in summer in the continental climate, but not particularly here. And you compare it with the ceiling mounted fan, and ceiling mounted fans, retrofitting those is a fraction of the cost and vastly more cooling, evaporative cooling effect that you get from it. And then lastly, the point on the bottom left here, the cost people, specialists we had, said, don't lift the floorboards for ventilation ducts. So we started looking at how you could integrate ducts into an existing dwelling without having to pull the whole of the dwelling to pieces, and therefore begin to get the costs down and the installation done quickly. And the lesson learned, I showed you this a variety, similar diagram earlier. This is the national grid across a year. The pink is what we currently generate and demand for electricity. The blue is if we shift homes over to heating. It more than doubles the capacity we need on the grid. And it is very peaky compared with the evenness currently. We don't have vast amounts of renewables just working in winter. They tend to operate across the whole year. And for the investment, and it's basically private investment, even if we pay for it ultimately, for the grid, they don't like those peaks because they use those peaks for a matter of a few weeks of the year. And the rest of the year, all that additional capacity on the grid is generating no income for them. So they would rather like to get rid of those peaks. And by halving heat demand, bring it down to the red level, we get rid of the worst of those peaks. And do you know what? There's £90 billion saving in just that, which could be redirected into retrofit. So what kind of out-of-the-box thinking are we looking at a detailed level to try and reduce costs? Is it possible to put in a replacement heat pump in a dwelling in 2 days, complete changeover in 2 days? Currently, it takes between a week and 2 weeks. Well, first thing is you try and look at, as I mentioned before, reuse the radiators, try and make sure you retain as much of the system as you can. This works at a number of different levels. Minimize the cost. It also minimizes the additional embodied carbon you're putting in. The more you can retain and not have new equipment. But the key component here is to take your combi boiler out and to replace it with a thermal store which is sized to fit into the space vacated by your combi boiler. You've got all your pipes there, you've got electrics there, so forth and so on. Now that heat store is needed because a heat pump trickle charges that to give you the hot water that you then need for your taps. And you need a thermal store. Normally they are top right, big cylinder, need a room for it, please. But the aim of using a thermal store, a heat battery, is it's got a phase change material. Imagine when water changes to ice, but it uses an organic material which changes phase at about 50 degrees. Now, an awful lot of energy goes into that change from liquid to solid, and it is able to store vastly more heat in a smaller container than water would. On the back of this, lo and behold, you've taken your boiler out. You've already got a ready-made hole through the wall for your pipes to go to the air source heat pump. You're minimizing the amount of work needed. We're looking at smaller heat pumps you can wall mount, as opposed to enormous great things that sit on the floor. And looking at the radiators and the reuse, one of the things we identified was this idea of just sufficient fabric first insulation such that the radiators don't need replacing. Now that limits how much insulation you need to do. I'll explain a little more about that in a moment. Here gives a list of the typical kind of things for the archetype we looked at. We dearly love to spend time doing a lot of different archetypes, and I'm sure some of the housing developments you are occupying or looking at retaining will have different forms and so forth and so on. What we want to put over is a way of thinking which is applicable across different housing types. But we wanted to use the average in the UK. So the average size, the average space, typically 85 square meters, for example, to try and illustrate how it can be done physically at a design level as well as cost it. And there's a whole set of things in there which give us clear benefits in cost and program terms in particular. But first and foremost, you need to know what's in your building to start with. So a good survey of what's involved, for example, and then afterwards do a finishing survey so that you can then see before and after the savings and so forth, and provide a warranty of performance. Who gives a warranty in the current market for your energy systems, suggesting what the bills should be? They run a mile. We feel you ought to be able to get that. There's virtually nothing else you go out there and buy which doesn't come with some kind of warranty of the performance you're paying an awful lot of money for. I'll now switch looking at the cost to illustrate what I talked about, 2/3 reduction. Here we've got a cost breakdown of a whole house retrofit. Good practice, shall we say. It might be something ACB, for example, illustration as an illustration. And we started to take to pieces where these big costs were. If you look at the mechanical systems in there, the pinky ones in the middle, there's a lot of money in there. The windows, there's a lot of money in there. For example, insulation, there's a lot. Management, design, supervision, enormous sums of money in there. And we began to talk with the specialists about how do you start to drive out these things? You've seen some of the thinking out of the box for the air source heat pump and so forth and so on. And the idea for the ventilation, the MVHR. But we found things like, for example, there's a lot of cost-effective air tightness things, mastic gun, ceiling doors and windows and so forth, which are not normally seen as leading components of a retrofit, but they are basically very cost effective, achieve very good return on investment. But you need the MVHR to guarantee that you don't make it so airtight you're not getting any fresh air. But we are providing that to make sure that we can push those cost-effective energy savings, for example. We found windows. Apparently, the average age of double glazing is about 38 years. I was a bit staggered by that number and went back to Building Research Establishment, BRE, to check it. But fundamentally, that's how long windows typically cost. So the idea, this then got us to the point of actually 87% of homes in the UK already have double glazing. And the vast majority of those still have 2/3 of their life left. So how about refurbishing in situ? And you start talking to people who've been involved in it, and you find basically it's replace the hinges to get the gaskets to lay. But once again, I'll come on to some of those in a little more in a moment. But we went through all of this to try and squeeze out where the money is to get it from the left down to the right. And in the report, there's an awful lot of numbers for those people who might want to see the numbers of where we've identified there's money to be got rid of. For example, if you've got temporary welfare facilities on site for 6 months, it costs you an awful lot more than keeping them on site for 7 days per dwelling, for example. But I'll move on. These are the typical building fabric things. I talked about airtightness. The idea of replacing the hinges. You can do a house like this in a day, 700 quid, something of that order, to replace half the hinges of the windows which are leaking. And you see it then in the airtightness testing afterwards, the amount of heat you're then retaining. Airtightness on front doors, loft hatches or other access hatches, so forth. Sealing around skirting boards. Industry just doesn't do it. And yet that can be extremely cost effective for sealing leakage below floors and cavities in walls, for example. It's not rocket science. It may need a little bit of repair after 15 years or so, but it's easily accessible when you redecorate, for example. And then in insulation terms, surprise, surprise, deep insulation in the loft really gives you benefits. But also looking at what they call wind wash protection, which is what Passive House have talked about. You don't want the air that goes through the loft to prevent condensation over the insulation, moving that cold air moving through the insulation. You actually want to be able to make sure that wind wash is pushed above the insulation, particularly around the eaves. Things like external wall insulation. We didn't know until we took it apart that the cost of doing the flank wall, surprise, surprise, is dramatically cheaper than doing the front wall. Because basically you tend to have very few windows and interruptions. You're not cutting the boards. You haven't got edge details around every window. And that's before doing battle with the local planners, because actually they would rather like to keep the front of the house as it looks. And a lot of householders also rather like to keep what their dwellings look like. So we identified the most cost-effective thing was do those flank walls, possibly some on the back if you need to, but you can often avoid having to do that. We identified where most of the condensation occurs, say the bathroom, and it's normally in the reveals around the window. And therefore the idea of using a foam board, this is PVC, dare I say, but it's off the shelf. It's a fascia board material. You just cut and fit. It allows you to get an airtight seal against the glazing and the wall at the same time and address condensation area and give you a washable surface on the inside, for example. So those interesting little tricks we uncovered in our foraging. On the services side, on the left, no floorboards to be lifted, no separate plant rooms. The principle was we will not take one additional square inch of internal area. It's too high a priority. Hence, as mentioned before, the heat battery replaces your combi boiler. That's where your domestic hot water is. The wall-mounted heat pump, the ceiling-mounted flat ventilation unit, and then looking at ventilation system. If you look at the image bottom right, or the one roughly to the left in the middle, you can see ductwork put in the hallway and up the stairway. It is just wander down to your wholesale, standard PVC off-the-shelf ductwork, cheap and cheerful. And yes, one thinks about PVC and its environmental impact, but actually, unless we're going to get rid of all our electrical wiring, we're going to have PVC in the home anyway. And the industry, disposal industry, is now moving on. There's specialist people who will take PVC and recycle it. It doesn't have to go into the incinerating part, emit some dioxins because we haven't burnt it at the appropriate temperature. So I'm more flexible on using the products we've got available, because unless we use the products that we are available, we're not hit zero carbon, and the implications for wider society will be, well, I needn't go any further. But one of the tricks here in ventilation terms is to avoid taking ducts below the floor is we use nozzle air supply grills. And the advantage of those is they jet across the ceiling to the other side. They get your air to the other side of the room without having to duct across there. And the air then goes back below the undercut doors and heads off to the kitchen or the bathroom under the undercut doors to be extracted in there and back through the heat recovery. You make it as simple as you possibly can. I will finish with a number of highlight slides, shall we say. This is the breakdown on the left of where the money comes from. It talks about roughly a third is what CCC already had in the budget for home retrofit. About a third is how do we motivate the able to pay who get asset appreciation and energy bill savings. And then there's about a third of additional items. I talked about the renewables, I talked about the grid. There's apparently 18 billion per year spent on health and related social issues because our homes aren't heated properly. A lot of that goes into the NHS. We looked at, could we grab that money to put into retrofit to reduce that? Well, actually, you can't take it out of the NHS because it's so underfunded, or shall we say, politically correct to say, so many alternative needs for that money within the NHS, you won't get that money out. But some of the annual grants and so forth, if you reduce the heat demand and give people good homes, you can get some of that back. So you begin to see a top-down equation which says we're not adding to the money needed. And then on the right, we came up with an equation which said, yeah, there's a place for NFIT, about 5% possibly. That's about, 100 times larger than the current market. So there's plenty of expansion potential there. Best practice, well, that's going to be that's for those who are able to pay and those who want to go further. We found there was only 2% or thereabouts of the really ultra historic buildings we couldn't touch. Most buildings in conservation areas you can get at if you're not going to disrupt the front face, for example. And you can see this new basic approach for more than 2/3 of property. I'm just going to highlight processes because some of these are essential to this process of delivering this approach. We want to eradicate that 40% of overheads. To give you an idea, one of the issues is you've got lots of trades who are all individual companies. They don't work together that well. So, for example, when they have to decide what they're doing to start with, they all come and survey the property separately. You'll have an insulation person who does it. The retrofit assessor will be there, good. But then you've also got the heat pump installer. He'll come along. The ventilation people that will come. The amount of people coming to do surveys when one survey done by an assessor should be appropriate for all of those. And indeed, you can start to automate it so they all get the information they need if you can consolidate it all in one place. But that needs a single contractual entity to include all trades. So each one isn't protecting their own backside. They're all employees within one organization. And that becomes a key component. Because if you look at the program, the 7-day program, one of the items we discovered was the heat pump supplier doesn't turn up until all the insulation is done. And then he comes along and has a look at it and he has to slot it into his program. So another 3 weeks later, he comes along and he starts his work. That is not how an efficient industry works. Just-in-time delivery is what you hear from other industries. The idea the insulation's complete or indeed done in parallel because one's working on one part of the building when the other's working on the other. That is what advanced programming should do. But ultimately, you want them all in the same organization so you've got flexibility between the trades and certainly no downtimes between the trades. They arrive with the materials they actually need because they know what they're actually doing as opposed to covering all opportunities. Then the local enabling and in implementation teams, engaging locally to identify dwellings to drive a continual workflow. That's what the trades want. They want to be able to move from one home to the next quickly without having to, oh, well, what do we fill the next couple of days because they're not ready for us on the next one. That is where the effort needs to go, and you need a closely knit team for that. But working with the occupants, working with the owners, trying to build trust so the householders learn from people who've already had it done because they know them, they're down the street sort of thing. That kind of thing is absolutely essential as opposed to coming in cold and the workforce having to travel halfway across the country because they were the lowest tender for whatever you ordered up. So you can see the need for local enabling and implementation teams. The in-depth survey I talked about, the idea that we need to know exactly where the air leaks are before you turn up. So the guy knows he's bought the right materials to plug those holes and he knows exactly which rooms he's going in to do this, that, and the other. Smart data, meter data to identify real energy use. Identifying components to be retained. We just need to replace those hinges, those double glazing will be fine. Trying to identify defects in the existing building which need to be dealt with before you start the energy side of things, for example. Keep it simple. Absolutely. You saw that installing the heat pump. Keep it as simple as possible. And the idea that the level of it astounded me that the air source heat pump was being sized without taking into account the insulation which was going in. Oh, well, I did my survey earlier on at the wrong. No, we want coordination between these because we want a smaller heat pump. Avoid complexity and controls. You don't need a boost on ventilation. Just run it constantly in the back. Satisfies Part F of the building regulations, no problems. minimizing stripping out, minimizing new materials, so forth. And then finally, on policy highlights, support for retrofit-specific products and process development. We do need help to be able to, that heat battery, you can buy them to go on the floor for the big dwellings, but they say there isn't any demand for smaller ones which fits into the slot vacated by your combi boiler. We need to develop those. We know the technology works. We need to work in enough people who are involved in this to be able to develop these kind of products, just like the ventilation unit. Trying to move from EPC single measure guidance to whole house retrofits, because that's where the cost benefits come. Fabric first, but only just sufficient to allow the simplified heat pump applications. We use the heat pumps, multi-skill training and so forth and so on for the productivity step change. And then trying to look at the shift into locally driven retrofit. I touched on earlier, consumers, providing them with whole house or whole dwelling information, including finance, not commercially driven info on single measures, which is what the majority of you get if you go online for information on retrofit. And you have to say most housing associations, most local authorities are in exactly the same boat, that they're being bombarded with commercial information on, oh, this product was safe, it will give you X number of SAP credits or what have you. The idea of one-stop shop past 2035 is a management process for helping you get all the bits there. Guaranteed energy performance, making sure local area energy planning focuses on the process of retrofit, not deciding the energy supply. That's been sorted. That's done with someone else. I have to say there's a need to review the extent of heat networks some people are looking at. This is another commercially driven single source pushing heat networks. They work in certain circumstances, but I don't think they'll get to anything like the 20% Climate Change Committee has been convinced to put in because of the marketing from the heat networks commercial companies. And ultimately trying to make sure we locally get the co-benefits of the health, the wealth, the fuel poverty, the social support and so forth. And ultimately highlights the idea at high levels, talking to government, the idea of redirecting investment into from a smaller grid capacity into reducing demand, retrofit. I talked about export revenue for the excess green energy we'll produce. Then starting to scale up social housing decarbonisation funding, whatever label they wish to call it now, and trying to look at a green energy profits supplementary tax, because we know they're making a lot of profit on those things at the moment. It's exactly the same mechanism, North Sea gas, North Sea oil. It's all, we're only talking a couple of percent, for example. We're looking at grids cost savings to fund eco type approach for PRRS, so private rented sector. The idea of they provide, the energy supply companies provide a turnkey package, the minimum standard, a basic retrofit with all these measures for a lump sum, which is paid for by the energy suppliers, for example. And I could go on, owner-occupiers. Then there's the issues of social and environmental cost currently on electricity, which disincentivizes the switch to heat pump, zero rating in certain circumstances where you achieve an energy retrofit standard, moving away from energy costs based on peak marginal gas for those who are in the know, and shifting net zero carbon targets to energy peak control for those who are interested in that. So I finish. We're proposing an alternative basic whole house retrofit approach, new take on materials, processes, procurement, vast potential to improve how we do retrofit, but beware the vested interests. Very interesting. All those people from LETI stepped out of their day jobs to work with, and some of them were suggesting things which would not have been met with open arms by their day job employers, for example. And so it's a key component. So the potential to halve heat demand and get to net zero without additional cost, step change in productivity is absolutely key. Need for a holistic approach, not fragmented measures, top-down shifting of funding, raft of household and wider social benefits. And this document hopefully add some more meat onto what I've said. So Retrofit-at-Scale is there as a free download. And there's a website, and if you've got your camera to hand, that's the link to it. At which point, I will finish. So Nicola, how do you want to take it from here?
A second. Thank you immensely, Chris. Just to say hello to everybody, and I hope that from the years and that it was taken in all the different aspects of going through this, from a social aspect to a technical aspect and so on and so forth. I do know that I hope. For me, that was a really good summary of the issues from a social, political, financial, and technical point of view. So thank you so very much. Obviously, what we're going to do right now, Chris, is we're going to open up to questions. We do have an oh, no, that was for somebody else. Don't worry about that. Okay, so what we're going to do is, we don't have any questions actually in the chat. So let's just do it. I'll leave you as host, obviously, Chris. If we can just, hands up. Let's just go with hands up and do the normal, good old-fashioned hands up. Alice.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. That's very, I have looked at the document before, but hearing it from you sort of summarized in that way was really helpful. I think it does kind of challenge quite a lot of the, accepted way of thinking about retrofit, which I think is the right thing to do. But I think it will take some time for people to kind of be able to make that transition in the way that they think. I'm just wondering what you think the time scale is to get all the things that you were describing as being necessary, particularly on the procurement side of things. How long do you think it's realistically going to take before it can be sort of ramped up to the sort of delivery phase that you have in mind?
Well, I think there's an element of step by step, and there's an element of critical mass, as you'll probably recognize. So, for example, you talk to people like Sunamp about the heat batteries, and they say, well, we need some demand, and we're not seeing it at the moment. Well, there's chicken egg here. There's no product to use. How can there be demand for it? And therefore, the idea that a whole set of local authorities, potentially housing associations, whatever, could get together and perhaps approach the likes of Innovate UK for some pump priming money, because they've got it there. They've got money there to help the likes of Sunamp produce a product that we need on the basis we've then got a need to then use it. So I think there's a way that we can unlock a whole set of these. On things like the MVHR, the ventilation, you could go online and buy them from China. Admittedly, one would want to check, buy a few samples beforehand. But the fact is, they make our mobile phones, and the quality of those is, superlative. They can deliver, and I saw they could deliver. So it's identifying which products, testing them for our use, and then buying them by the container load. So you we were looking at costs, something which costs an MVHR, all singing, all dancing in the UK, minimum cost is something like £1,600. But a lot of them go up to 2,500. You can buy them for 350 to 400 quid retail price in China. So discount on a larger volume, for example. So you realize there is plenty of opportunity, and we're looking at a simple box, not the all singing, all dancing BMW or Rolls-Royce example, which is great for those bits of the market which are doing best practice and exemplar, but not for that bulk, for example. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a taster that there's a process here, and it's generating the interest when people see there is something we can do. I think there are things like building teams, local teams, which start taking on aspects of that to start with. And some of the existing funding streams could use integrated teams, for example, to see how that allows you to shorten programs and, for example, reduce costs that way. Anyway, right. A little bit long and rambling, that one. My answer.
Thank you.
Georgina.
Yeah, I've got a ton of stuff to say. Where do I start? Yeah, I mean, at the moment, well, there's several problems, you know, like with the social housing decarbonisation fund, for a start. I mean, for example, I'm living on a council estate that recently was awarded some of this funding. There was funding to do 250 properties, but only 28 were going to be done on our estate, and only council homes. And that, I mean, as soon as they said that, it flagged up to me that they don't understand what they're doing, because you can't retrofit blocks piecemeal and expect to get, you know, a good retrofit. And of course, the other problem is that the decarbonisation fund can't be used for leaseholders. So we've got 66 leaseholders, 100 council tenants. The funding doesn't fit what needs to be done. And so, I mean, that's something that kind of needs, the government really needs.
Well, arguably, the problem's in the title. Is a demonstrator. It is not a mass rollout, as you suggest. We need to move it into a mass rollout. And at the moment, they are not generating the cost savings they thought through the demonstrators to then start to look at wider rollout. So you've hit the nail on the head. But at the moment, there isn't the thinking as to how it can be done differently, as opposed to just doing the same as we've always done.
Okay, and the other thing is that, I mean, I've been banging on about this for ages. Some of you on the chat will know will know this. But for example, in Lambeth, where I live, it seems to me that they've actually presented themselves by accident with an ideal scenario to kind of doing the retrofit as it should be done. And that is, as I say, they've earmarked 6 estates for demolition. It's looking at as though, well, 3 might be pulled, but 3 might be going ahead. I live near to one of them, South Lambeth Estate. So pretty much every day I go past these low-rise blocks, and most of them are empty. I found out that out of 101 properties, there's only 4 leaseholders left. And on estates, it's a problem getting the funding to do the retrofit because of the leaseholders having to pay into it. And yet they've now presented themselves with estates that have very few leaseholders on, and they're almost empty, and they could be retrofitting the whole estate to get a much better, deeper retrofit. And what I've been advocating for is that they use these estates as training grounds so that they can get their own retrofit workforce, hopefully employed by the councils, a direct labour force, to kind of bring all that knowledge in-house, which they can then roll out onto other estates, you know, whenever they can. But they would be getting the expertise on these empty properties. And getting nowhere, just being told by the council, you're blockers, we're the builders, you know, the standard phrase. But it's
Well,
like, they're missing a trick. And is there any way that we can devise a program to kind of present to them so that they don't have to do the work, to say, look, this is really a goer, and can't we just try and get
I'm guessing, are they expecting to increase the density dramatically on those estates?
Absolutely they are. But the estate that I'm talking about, they'll end up building fewer council homes than now exist. And the whole reasoning for demolishing the places was to help house the homeless. But they're building
ultimately, they are
it, but they're not building the housing that they need, and they're spending so much money on housing, you know, temporary accommodation, you know, and what you were saying earlier about costs for the NHS and whatever, they're not joining the dots. They're not alone. Government isn't joining the dots. What can we do to try and encourage them to come to their senses?
We do need to make
and
sure
have their own workforce as well. And of course, that would mean like hopefully a local thriving economy, with people in well-paid jobs. And what you were saying earlier as well about workforces having to move, you know, from one area of the country to the other, they would be kind of homegrown and nurtured, and hopefully they would kind of keep the nurturing going within the borough for many years to come. Sorry, I shut up now.
Well, I'm sure that something can be done, but it needs, if it's an approach to the borough, one needs to be able to illustrate a funding model, because I'm guessing that they are expecting to wipe that out, shall we say, 100 homes and put 200 homes on there, of which a significant number are for sale, which helps to fund the overall redevelopment. Now, if you're going to propose,
that's been shown actually, that's been shown to be it doesn't work, the kind of funding kind of model, you know, build private to build the council.
why are they
proved to be a complete and utter failure. So even that is a non-starter as far as I'm concerned. But I mean, how, or is there anyone on this chat who would be interested in trying to work out how funding could be leveraged, or work out a way of doing this? I don't.
Well, you need people with economics backgrounds as well as the technical side of things, because ultimately the borough will only listen when you come up with an economic model as to how it can be done. And I'm sure, you know, we feed into that by saying you can do retrofit in a more efficient way to reduce the costs, but you need someone who speaks their language to be able to say, and this is how you could do it, order of magnitude, not the detail, but order of magnitude, say, and you could do it now, as opposed to having to wait until whichever funding stream might come along to do 5% of your homes in future. But I'm sure we can all input.
Just to say that this is, I'll pass on in a second, just to say that this is very much the reason why we have been trying to approach council heads, because we, and London and London-wide council sustainability people as well, because we want to say, here is a model All right. And as Chris says, if we could get it specced up, even if we did it, for example, I'm just putting it out there, if we did it as a model, for example, on South Lambeth Estate, we casually put together the figures. That's not a full package, but we take an exemplar. We take a role model exemplar. We package that in ballpark figures. And then not only would it be, this is a current life example right now, but there's also the model. Right. And yeah, that is why we are in terms of the dissemination of the project, we're keeping on going to constantly contact those in councils, those in local authorities. Has just left. He happens to actually be in local authority. And I will certainly catch up with him at another point in time to ask about where they're standing right now with forthcoming funding models and what their imperatives are. What he has said so far is that they follow the same model that Georgina's talking about, okay, which is getting in the funding and then the private plays for the public. But as we know, in those deep dives, it's not happening. There's less council housing than there was before. Next person.
Okay. Thomas has got a question in the chat. Technical one. With regard to phase change or SunApp, do these come with a performance drop compared with an insulated hot water tank? No. And indeed, you can go into their catalogue and say, I want 150 litre water equivalent. And they will tell you what size and how much it will be smaller. So it works in a slightly different way. You haven't got the same temperature drop off. It tends to stay static and then drop off steeply. But those are lesser order technical issues. But in principle, it's just a heat store. Hope that helps. Right. Any other questions?
Please forgive me. I forget your real name, Spanifex. Please forgive me.
Yes.
I think you're just unmuting. You were talking about how they're in hock with developers, and this is the real problem as well. Right, and we've got to. I think you're just waiting to unmute. You're still. Oh, let me unmute you. I'm going to put in a request. Hang on. Chris is the host.
Okay.
I want to hand over to you, Spanifex, regarding your issue of them being in bed with developers. All right, because this has been the recurrent problem, is that there are vested interests, ones that are very easy to track in the public domain as well.
Yeah, I mean, it feels, yes, sorry, I don't know what the delay was, but from observing the NHS, the last 2 decades, we've had, there's no money, there's austerity, right? So the local government's got no money. And so it's over to the private developers who get to pull the strings. And it feels that that's why there's such an imbalance of power. So I'm thinking of, it's a bit of a side issue, but Wimbledon Park in Wimbledon, they're allowing the ATLEC to basically build some giant big Wimbledon complex, which is completely not what should be going on environmentally. I went along to the court case for it, but when you've got a big developer with lots of money chewing off the ear of the local councillors and sort of coercing in a way people to come in and go for what they want, the voice of the little man is ignored. But I think this is just such a no-brainer. It's such a superb body of work. It's really, really clear. I think we should reach out to people like Dale Vince and those people that are really on it and motivated, and because it's a no-brainer. And for me, if we could get it so that you present it to the local authority, that you could particularly, these estates that are being knocked down, if we did say get a model or a pilot of apprenticeships where you get young people who can be trained up in all of the particular skill sets required, so that you can then basically go in there with your retrofit assessor and streamline a way of doing all these things, and then also have someone going to source the right source heat pumps. I think we just need to kind of do it. I think the council's not going to do it, but if we try and get access to grants and green money, which is knocking about, I mean, definitely Merton has got loads of green grants available. They just don't have the ideas. And I mean, that's why I'm so grateful to be part of these groups, because I work full time. I hardly have any time, but I feel like I'm just sort of screaming in a vacuum and I don't know how to mobilize stuff. Like in my borough, there's a climate action group and whatnot, but it doesn't doesn't seem to be doing anything that's sort of influencing things properly. But I read this amazing document that you've presented and summarized again tonight. I spent, I don't know, several weekends last year summarizing it because I was so passionate and excited about it. And I wrote to my local council in Merton going, look at this, isn't it amazing? Why aren't you doing it? And their kind of sustainability environmental lead was like, oh yeah, no, we're not doing it. But wouldn't tell me why. And then that was kind of the end of the conversation. So it just feels like they don't really know or care. It's their day job. They're just sort of following the lead of what is put under their nose by the wealthy with their influencers. And meanwhile, we're getting further and further away from what we need to be doing to deliver what the people need. So I think we just keep going. We have to model the change. Yeah, I don't know. That's all I can think at the moment.
Please forgive me. I see you there, Alice. I see you. I just want to quickly say by way, just to respond to you in terms of disseminating stuff. My email is here in the chat. All right, email me, and then I can put people on a mailing list, all right, with updates, which means that you can email back, CCing Chris and I when you forward onto local authorities, so that I can expand the database, the centralized database of who we are contacting. Does that make sense? Okay, that will just kind of support an ever-widening kind of spider's net of voice about this. Please forgive me, Alice. I just wanted to say that administratively. You're muted, Alice. Thank you. You're muted.
That's a good idea about getting the word out, Nicola. I've just got a slightly boring technical question, which is when you've got a block of flats that looks like that with access balconies, you take your boiler out of your kitchen and the flue is sort of, fixed to the underside of the balcony.
Yes.
Swapping over putting in a heat pump in that location isn't going to work. So what would the solution be? Your centralized heat pumps?
Well, first of all, I will not dive into the rather attractive opportunity, which I said you shouldn't do, which is look at individual measures without actually understanding the building properly.
Yes, but it's this idea of the heat store and replacing the boiler with a heat store, and then
so these are combi boilers, are they, on the other end of the?
Many housing estates do have combi boilers because all their district heating has been stripped out and they've all been replaced with combi boilers. So I'm just trying to think. I mean, it's such an attractive option that you've described with the heat store.
Well, shall we say the Dutch in particular have done a whole series of retrofits, some of which Energy Sprong has taken on board, which involve doing something up the outside, which contains the heat pumps on each floor with both sides.
Right, I'm with you.
So on the other side of the deck access, you end up with something on the outside which contains a lot of these heat pumps, which then connect into the heat battery, which replaces the combi boiler in the individual.
Thank you for that.
For example.
But
I won't go any further until one understands a little
fair enough.
more about what looks like an interesting archetype, which one would love to get involved in. But yes.
Well, that just happens to be South Lambert Estate, isn't it? Georgina, is that the one you were talking about, or is it a different block?
Not sure.
That is the one that was up for demolition, and there was a demo outside. I think South Lambert Estate is lower from my knowledge of it. Georgina, you're muted. Just in terms of replying, if that is actually South Lambeth Estate, that image.
In the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry. What did you say? I need to look through the chat again. You asked me, is that South Lambeth Estate?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
There's a photo.
Okay. I mean, I suppose I kind of was interested in what had been done in France for the Lacaton and Vassal, the way that they'd kind of built like large balconies around the whole, or around kind of the length of the building, So you're kind of creating an extra kind of balcony space. Actually, I mean, these flats don't actually have balconies. They used to, but they've been closed off. So it would actually, if you closed off the walkways that you can see there, but then built an additional kind of walkway beyond that, there would be a place for the heat pump, and it would also give you them an external individual kind of indoor-outdoor space to use as well. So it would be increasing their space. This
is where we have to be very careful.
I don't know if it's possible, but
this is where we have to be very careful. It is often very easy to see opportunities for what I referred to on one of the slides as betterment. You're providing more facility for the occupant, which is great, but someone has to pay for that over and above the energy measures. So if you want to try and slide some of these, giving extra floor area to individual tenants, I have no problems with that, but it's got to be paid for one way or another. So, very often people say, oh, well, we could do a £20,000 energy retrofit on each of these. And lo and behold, an awful lot of these things creep in, and you find most of that money's disappeared on those betterment or increased floor area and so forth and so on, as opposed to the energy and the comfort aspects.
I mean, as regards that extra area of space for use for the resident, where Lacaton and Vassal did it, their retrofit program actually came in cheaper than the demolition and rebuild. It's like half the cost. Now, I know there would be additional walkways and things that would have to be built, but I mean,
well, ultimately,
I don't know. Very frustrating.
This is beginning
we need to kind of try things out and see if it works, rather than just saying, "Well, no, we're just going to demolish it," and that's damaging too. Well, and they would actually end up with, like, on this particular estate alone, they would end up with like 97 extra council homes, whereas at the moment they'll end up with minus 11 or whatever. Yeah.
Are we all right? Can I say something, or does somebody else want to say something? Anybody out there? All right. I think there's very much, from what I can see, there's always this excuse of we need to build more homes, okay, which becomes the excuse for what is the reason, but then it becomes an excuse for demolition and rebuild, and that reduces the actual social housing, and people are complaining about that being a form of social cleansing, etc. And unfortunately, I think that what we have to do is really look at the potential for local councils to create, the things like award-winning models, groundbreaking precedents of how they solved the triple problem of people, planet, and public money. We've got to look for that kind of thing where all of a sudden a council gets it, or a group of individuals at a council or a developer gets it, and then they start model building, and then they win the awards and all of that kind of thing. And I'm really sorry, it shouldn't be about that. But at the end of the day, if we can get some kind of like switched where somebody does this out there, all right, it's got to be possible, even if it's a 100K job or a small unit job, right? Somebody does it out there and sets the way to say this is a new model and it can be done. So in terms of, because everybody's got different, like lots of people are doing an incredible amount of research and frontline work all of the time. So I think, again, it's thank you. Forgive me, I've forgotten your name again. Spanifex, lovely to meet you. And yes, absolutely, the video will be out ASAP. I think it's just that case of constant vigilance on the front line. Who wanted to speak? Forgive me.
I think that's covered all the queries in the chat.
Joseph, anything? Sabine?
This is Joseph here.
Hi.
My only question or observation is to do with the fact that the number of social homes that are with district heating or communal heating, so many of them are actually hugely inefficient right now.
Yeah.
And it's quite clear that government sees that this could be, or this would be a very good way of trying to meet their net zero standards by increasing the number of heat networks that are around. And my concern is that the way in which they currently operate are as hugely inefficient systems, and I can't see how they will become better at achieving the efficiencies that's required, particularly with the ones that are already built. But even though they are already built, there's a lot of them are very old. They're aging, and they require a lot of infrastructure funding if they are ever to reach a stage whereby they are sufficiently efficient enough to be a viable option. So that's really my concern with this.
And I would agree with you. And I would add another thing is those heat networks will need to switch over to become heat pumps. A heat pump as opposed to gas. At the moment, they've been relying on cheap gas, very cheap gas, because they get bulk discounts. They will be shifting into electricity, which is a lot more expensive. So it becomes economically more difficult to run them. And the bills certainly don't come down for the end users. So yes, it is disappointing to see so much investment in something which will continue to be a black hole, because a lot of them are still being installed with gas-fired boilers because they can't afford to put the heat pumps in. So I generally agree with you, but that's the issue with vested interests driving the show. There's a lot of people writing guides and so forth saying district heating. Just give you one example. They quote Copenhagen. 98% of homes or buildings are connected to heat networks. We should be doing this. There is one subtle difference. Most of the homes they're connected to, buildings, are not well insulated and have reasonable, I won't say high energy bills, but there's a lot of income for the district network. We are tending to put heat networks into new building blocks. So they have relatively low income per dwelling because they're reasonably well insulated. And so the whole economic model of shifting from the model from Copenhagen to London doesn't work because the economic model doesn't work. But they quietly ignore the fact that they're dependent entirely on government handouts for the capital investment. They're not economically viable on their own. And I can't see a future when they will be. But that doesn't really help us move forward in being able to offer a model to local authorities and what have you of an alternative way forward. So I'm interested in what Nicola was saying about, how do we find a group of the willing to then match it with some innovative funding to demonstrate what can be done at a whole different levels, from how you put the process together, integrated teams, because You have to say people who learn how to do install heat pumps, they're sitting happy. They're installing oversized products. There's overwhelming demand for their services. They can charge what they like. Why would they want to come and join local authority teams? So you're going to have to probably grow them yourself. Integrated teams with someone who helps put in some insulation and puts in basic heat pumps, for example. So it needs that thinking through.
It's a terrible hen and egg situation of where is it going to start? And I think it has to start with this kind of chip away and get it into the voices of many people, get it into the inboxes of many people. Just keep on right at the front line. Okay, so that it becomes a referenced model, a repeatedly referenced model. It's in terms of cost, a lot of councils that we know, as we know, have been going bust. Okay, we know that there's this huge issue of council bankruptcy. What we would like to do is find a vested interest whose interest lies in not bankrupting the council, retaining social housing, fixing up empty buildings, empty properties, okay, retrofitting affordably, and doing all of this, making it cost effective for themselves. And on top of this, and I hate to have to say this is a vestige of my years in union work, is that people care about reputation. They really do. Those in power care about reputation. We want to have to.
I think one also needs to bear in mind that part of what this report did was identify where, if you reduce heat demands, where is the capital savings? And that will need fairly high up in government saying, well, you're saving some money because we're not having to build as much grid. Can we redirect that through Eco7 or whatever one likes to call it, a mechanism for taking where is that money and where do you need to put it? And yes, there's a reputation benefit and so forth of doing it. The idea that we can just magic up the kind of numbers which are being talked about is difficult. What one can say, and obviously not applicable to new build, is there's £7,500 grant for heat pumps, for example, switch over. Now, that's if you can bring down the whole cost of the retrofit into those kind of order of magnitudes, you get that with no questions asked as to how much heat pumps actually cost you. Now, at the moment, it typically costs you twice that amount. And we're saying it should cost half that amount if you reduce the size of it and so forth and so on, and you control the process. So, we're going to have to put together a whole set of where's the funding coming from components to be able to convince some of these authorities.
I know this is thinking out the box, but I literally have this little dream that all of a sudden there is this property and it's in the works for demolition, for so-called regeneration, and the team is put together and they can start to ad hoc spec out. And I know it's a difficult task because without actually testing and checking the building properly, you can't do it fully. All right, I understand that. I understand that. But if we worked on the building, on creating a case study, all right, a projected case study that could be incorporated, that would solve all of these problems, public, money, planet, and people, okay, the triple problem, triple solution, if that could be put into a presentation of a case study, okay, I think, thinking in terms of what is possible and creating that in a proposition, I don't know what anybody thinks about that. Georgina?
Yeah, just going back to South Lambeth Estate and just picking up on something. I mean, I told you earlier that the estate where I live got social housing decarbonation fund money, which ended up being pulled because they realised that they couldn't spend it effectively. They couldn't come up with a plan. I presume that's gone to the other estates. But the point is, this funding was to retrofit over 200 properties. And on South Lambeth Estate, there's 101 properties that need doing. So it's like, if there's money to retrofit, they're now in a position where they're finding it difficult to find a developer to develop that estate, to do what they want, to kind of, build higher density housing. So finding it hard to find a developer. At the same time, they're now refurbishing some of the properties that were left empty to put in temporary tenants before they perhaps demolish it in the future. So, I mean, just the whole thinking is just crazy. They could have used that funding plus the funding that they are using to refurbish some of the properties anyway, and actually ended up with more council housing. But I guess it depends on one's political will, and one has to question what Lambert's political will is regarding having any more council housing.
Well,
That's an issue.
I'm aware, for example, with the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, some of the people have had problems because they can only spend it on property which are EF or something like that. They're not bringing, and they only work out after they've got the money. They do all the EPCs to work out how many of them actually are at that level.
Yeah.
And if they find a fair number of them are better than that, very slightly, the funding falls through, because it's not there to demonstrate marginal improvements, it's there to demonstrate fairly big improvements. So lo and behold, their application for funding collapses. So it's getting into detail, but it somehow needs us to talk to some of these people with something on the table, with people who understand their finance models, to be able to unstitch some of those and say there is an alternative. Because unless you've got the finance model, they'll think you're on a different planet. Anyway.
So my question is, could we approach a Green Party run council with this to see whether or not they might be willing to take the risk in terms of, even if it's a small scale experiment, to see how it goes, and then maybe they might look at rolling that out further.
Sounds good.
I mean, for me, it just seems that no other political party is coming at this from the right sort of angle, and the only one that possibly could is the Green Party. So where are they in power in the local council, and could we approach them and see whether or not they would be willing to actually take this on board? But it's more than just it being taken up as part of a policy by the Green Party.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. But actually,
it's about practically getting this thing off the ground by approaching a Green Party council.
I agree.
And getting them to see the sense that this makes.
I agree completely.
Ultimately, the politicians would need to convince or have the support of the officers. The officers will respond and say, technically, physically, whatever, can it be done? So we can approach both ends. Someone who works for the sort of officer side as well as the politicians. You don't want either of them sort of stamping on it. You want them to see the opportunities of mutual benefit.
From a financial point of view, there's this big issue of that this is cost cutting. It does all the right things. It taps into all of the policies, and it's cost cutting. And that has got to be a point of win for a council to say we balanced all of our books and we did the right thing. Okay, because there is a huge ground level voice fighting against demolition. multiple council estates across London. It's not that it's not recognised as a social voice. I mean, they've slowed down 3 projects in Lambeth, which is a huge accomplishment, from 6 down to 3. That's a massive accomplishment. That would not have happened without the ground level lobbying. You know, and this is and this is the no-brainer solution. This is the thing that has been needed.
Excellent. Where do you see the steps forward then, Nicola, from here?
I think a lot of this is just in terms of like bringing together, there are lots of vested interests. Okay. And this is the right thing. All right. I don't mind on any level administrating, all right, a record of who we have on board. Okay, with no time commitments per se, just signing up in a sense to an ad hoc program of support and development. Because I think there's been so many years of lobbying that have got to this point where we're actually holding up a solution in our hands. Okay, and we can't lose this moment in 2025. All right. So from my point of view, I'm very, very happy to put you into a network that supports this. We have a dedicated group. I'd add you into the dedicated Retrofit-at-Scale group. It's not a general chat group. It's about furthering this particular interest of getting this built, all right, getting it put into policy and put into practice. What I would ask you to do is, because everybody's got their different excellent contacts, we've got to get critical mass from that. I would ask that when you write to people, okay, if you could please, when you write to your council, your housing association, your architect, whatever it is, could you please CC me in and CC Chris? Okay, I will administrate this. Chris doesn't have to respond to everything at all. Don't worry, Chris. Okay, I just want you to see some of it so that you have it there for reference. So that is my request to everybody. Okay, my email is, you got my number. If you don't have my number, my email, I've just put it up here in the chat. I'll put it in again. Email me. Email me. Excuse me, I know my own email. Email me, all right, and I will send you my details in terms of my phone number, etc. I'll give you my phone number as well right now if you want. And I'll put you into the Retrofit-at-Scale project group, which is dedicated to this in WhatsApp, okay? And when you have, like, for example, Georgina, you've contacted those people. That's totally amazing. That's your contact. That's your initiative, right? To keep Chris and I in the loop, if you can just CC us in, that means that then I can put together a database, a spreadsheet of who's been contacted, so that it saves us for cross-referencing further down, and it helps us to track everything more easily. My suggestion from here, yes, Georgina, you're muted.
Nicola, are you suggesting when I contact these people again, like the project manager, because although we're not going to get the full retrofit that was originally promised, we're going to get some of it, because we've still got single glazing, crystal glazing where I live. Yeah. So we're going to get double glazing, and they might do loft insulation. And what other structural things they find along the way, and new front doors as well, fire doors. Are you suggesting that when I contact them, I copy both of you in?
My suggestion is, it's obviously you're in an ongoing dialogue with them already. My suggestion is for those who are furthering the cause of the Retrofit-at-Scale project per se, okay, that if you wish to, I'm not going to engage, I'm not going to get involved in the dialogue. You see what I'm saying? You can even BCC me if you want. I'm not going to get involved in the dialogue. I'm not interested. That's not for me. It's just a case of tracking who's been contacted. Do you see what I'm saying? About the Retrofit-at-Scale. If it's about a separate topic, please don't worry at all. Does that make sense? And that's all entirely your choice. It's not to do with me intervening in anything. It's simply tracking points of interest. Does that make sense, Georgina?
And if they then choose to get in contact with Chris, would that be okay, Chris?
Well, I'm happy to field comments and redirect ultimately, or make sure Nicola's the key person understanding who's contacting who. But I'm
just wondering how best to proceed, that I've got your buy-in to it. Obviously, I don't want to copy you in if you don't really want to have to engage with them. But I suppose
ultimately the engagement.
I feel that there needs to be some education here because, as I say, when they had this money and they were just going to do 28 out of 166 in total properties, that to me was already shouting, this is not an appropriate use of funding. But they didn't see that. And they've already spent some of it on consultations, on surveys, which they don't seem, or they seem very reluctant to let us see. I'm going to have to do a freedom of information request to see the survey. I don't know. I'm pulling my hair out this end.
Joseph, the answer is yes. I have sent to the GLA, absolutely. And we are going to contact London Council people as well. I have some thoughts about how we should proceed. I present them and find out what everybody thinks. Okay. I think that running another one of these would be highly valuable because there are people who haven't been able to make it. And I think as well, we need to get to actually speak to the organizations as well. And then ultimately get into a position where there can be a presentation to a council about viability. Excellent, everybody. Chris, would you like to conclude before you and I have a little chat before we say goodbye?
Really, just thank you for those who were able to attend. It's useful to hear these different perspectives because then your mind begins to work what overlays might suit those different circumstances. I think one of the challenges, as we did find, was how we reconcile a lot of this with the costs. And not really surprising, but being able to talk to local authorities about costs and having something that they understand is an essential part of this process. And perhaps something we ought to do more work on. The LETI work identified where there was money, where there was savings, but it's not money we can immediately get at unless we have the top-down support. And that's where perhaps an avenue for exploring. So I think it's been useful at that level. For that, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.